Now, here is Lou Agosta.
This is Lou Agosta, and welcome to A Rumor of Empathy. Today, my special guest is Joseph Palombo. Dean Palombo is the founding dean of the Institute for Clinical Social Work, and he is the director of its Joseph Palombo Center for Neuroscience and Psychoanalytic Social Work. He's a faculty member of the Child and Adolescent Psychoanalytic Therapy Program, Institute for Psychoanalysis, Chicago. Dean Palombo has contributed numerous articles to the literature and 2 books, Nonverbal Learning Disabilities, A Clinical Perspective, and another book, Learning Disorders and Disorders of the Self in Childhood and Adolescence. Joe has co-authored the textbook, Guide to Psychoanalytic Development Theories, frequently used in courses on human development. Dean Palombo, Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lou. I appreciate your invitation.
Hey, it's great to have you here and a great opportunity to mix it up and have a conversation.
You know, I want to start a little bit with a comment about your book, A Rumor of Empathy, which was a little bit of a heavy reading, but I really enjoyed it. But I have a couple of thoughts about it that I wanted to share with you.
Thank you. Please do. A Rumor of Empathy, rewriting empathy in the context of philosophy.
Right. Well, the first one was the omission of Dildy's contribution to empathy from the chapters that you wrote. Was that sort of intentional, or because you didn't think of him as in the mainstream of philosophy?
Well, no softball questions here, Joe. Dildy, or otherwise known as Wilhelm Dilthey, depending how you,
Right.
how we choose to translate from the German here. He's not in the book because I had 55,000 words and had to make some decisions. More substantively, Rudolf McCreel, who is probably the premier Dilthey scholar in Western civilization, or at least in Europe and North America, argues that he's not a philosopher of empathy, Einfühlung. He's a philosopher of the imagination. He's a philosopher of reconstruction and of human relations, but not of empathy. So I would need at least another 10,000 words to explain how he really is, or perhaps is not, a philosopher of empathy. So some tough decisions there. I think that, does that answer the question?
It does. Well, the reason I thought of him is because, at least in the profession and the clinical practice, we think of him as having contributed to our understanding of empathy as a way of getting into people's experiences. You know, he talks about the lived experience of people as demonstrated, what people are like, and so through empathy we can access that.
Well, and I take the point. I take the in effect, it's not really a criticism, but if it were, that would be okay too. Dildy opens up a whole world of lived experience.
Right.
And for many of us who actually, are committed to understanding human beings in their humanness and in their struggles and in their empathy and lack of it, he would be on the radar.
Right.
So, some of it is, as I say, it's a poor excuse, word count. Nevertheless, one has to make some tough decisions. I decided to include the deep history of empathy, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book. But we want to get to the major action, your work on neuroscience. So why don't go ahead.
Maybe another thought that will transition to the topic. Has to do with the chapter on Hume, which I enjoyed the most, actually. And the reason I enjoyed it was because he presents empathy, or what he calls humanity, as a trait in human personality and human character that is to be admired, something that we think of as, an enlightened person, having a sense of humanity. And I was thinking how we have sort of lost sight of that in terms of our expectations of people, at least in public life nowadays, where we don't think of their humanity or their depth of empathy and capacity for empathy as what we would vote for if they were running for office.
And thank you for that. I mean, that's such a powerful and important thought. Hume, I have two associations to that. First, Hume was writing before the word empathy had been invented in the English language. David Hume is a commanding, towering master of the English language, and he writes about, he's got at least 5 different definitions of sympathy, including one that's mighty similar to what you and I would understand by empathy. He appreciates, quote, that the minds of men are mirrors to one another and emotions are reflected back and forth. It does remind me, what you say, of the humanity of the work of someone we want to talk about today because of your own experience, Heinz Kohut, one of the innovators of empathy. And I understand from so here's the question. I understand from our conversation before the show that you studied with Dr. Kohut, psychiatrist, faculty at the Institute for Psychoanalysis, faculty at, I believe, Michael Reese Hospital here in Chicago in its day, and innovator in the matter of empathy. So the question is, what were your experiences with him? Share something of that with me and with the audience.
I was fortunate in having started to work at the Institute for Psychoanalysis as the director of the child therapy program just in 1970, just as he was finishing up the work on his first book, The Analysis of the Self, and having essentially put into practice all that he had thought about in terms of how empathy enhances the work of the therapist and allows therapists to enter into the experience of their patients, deepening the relationship, but also uncovering aspects of their personalities that were not evident before. Now, what's interesting is that before 1970, Kohut had made an interesting contribution which bridges with what we were talking about Hume.
Yeah.
He was interested in narcissism. Narcissism at that time being seen in a pejorative light as people being self-invested, people being self-centered. And he thought that there was another facet to narcissism, which is a healthy expression of it that allows people to feel pride, confidence, assertiveness in a healthy way. And he posited that one's narcissism in a mature way translates into traits, not so much of humanity, although I think he would have liked the term, but he thought about creativity, humor, wisdom, and empathy as qualities that sort of allow the person to get beyond their self-centeredness, to care for others, and to...
That is so great. May I interrupt you at this point to for the benefit of those listeners who may not actually have a ready definition of what is empathy? How did Kohut define empathy? Let's be diligent and rigorous. Define our terms. You've defined narcissism. It can be a pejorative, a kind of negative, self-centered, I, me, mine. Look at how great I am. Or it can be a positive thing. My contribution, accomplishments, and in a broad sense. How would we define empathy here?
Well, he had a couple of definitions, but the ones that I sort of relate the most have to do with, first of all, decentering oneself, as I would put it, which means that instead of looking at the world from your own perspective, looking at it from the perspective of the experience of the person you're trying to understand. So you're walking in their shoes, you're experiencing with them how they feel about what has happened to them, and you then vicariously live through that experience.
And key term, vicarious there. Let me call that out. You vicariously live. So I have a vicarious, what is a vicarious experience? That's pretty important.
Well, when I think about vicarious experiences in clinical terms, I think about some of the patients that I see, for example. I've worked a great deal with children with learning disabilities. That's what I have written about.
Yes.
Now, we can take some of these children, and because of the ways their brains function, people look at them not understanding that what guides their behavior has to do more with their brain dysfunctions. And so they use judgmental terms. You're lazy, you're not trying hard enough, you're not interested, you're not motivated, sort of words that condemn the behavior. When I talk about vicarious, the introspecting, I get into that child's experience, and I say, what would it be like, if I couldn't read? What would it be like, if the world appeared to me as a puzzle where social contacts sort of were mysterious and I couldn't decode what others were saying? How would that feel?
Yeah.
And so trying to enter into that experience vicariously allows me then to get a deeper understanding and to gain some contact then with the person.
Let me give back to you. Let me pause for breath for a moment, because there's a lot there, for sure.
Yes.
And let me give back to you what I think I got, and you can tell me whether it's accurate or not. So a child of tender age, whatever, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on up, is dealing with school and some learning issues. And oftentimes, all too often, parents are human. It's a tough job being a parent. I want to give a shout out and acknowledge parents. Nevertheless, sometimes it comes across, what's the matter with you? Are you lazy? Do you give a darn? Do you really not care? God forbid somebody would use, there's all these devaluing terms, which we're not going to go into, right? Because that's the whole point. But rather, to have a vicarious experience of being inside, frustrating. The letters are swimming around on the page. The young person is being frustrated. People are on his or her case. The feeling of can't do anything right. And one has to have some sense of the perhaps frustration and anger, even if not rage, and not being understood in order for you as a clinician, as a educator, as somebody who's committed to making a difference, to get inside, for want of a better term, that experience and to make contact. Hey, that's not very easy. Am I getting it right?
Absolutely. You've described it very, very well.
One thing I also want to call out, since I'm kind of on the soapbox here, those of our listeners who go to the theater or watch movies or read novels will know about a vicarious experience, because we have a vicarious experience of the protagonist and of the hero or heroine or anti-hero in the movie or in the novel or in the show in the theater. And so it's a kind of experience of another's experience. And it's different. I want to call it out as different than compassion, as what we understand today. This is not David Hume, but what we understand today is a kind of sympathy, a reactive, altruistic response, which is definitely good. Heavens knows we need more altruism. Would you think I don't want to ask a yes or no question. You think Kohut would agree? So
this sort of echoes back to another theme in your book about aesthetic experience.
Yes.
The aesthetic experience being, that when we watch a play, we project ourselves into the characters. When we listen to a symphony, we project ourselves into, the sounds and immerse ourselves in that experience, which requires some form of empathy.
It does. It does recall. I mean, I want to make the connection with neuroscience because you call that out. It does recall the film Boyhood, which is currently out and about, and which I think is a contribution to our empathy of somebody growing up, and this individual has some learning challenges, but it has a happy ending. Not to give it away, more or less happy. A great flick for getting inside the head of a young boy.
Right. One of the things that we need to reference in relation to this is the whole issue of self-esteem and the relationship of the parental empathy for their child and the way it enhances the child's capacity to feel good about him or herself. There is a direct correlation between a parent who listens to the child, admires the child, praises the child, and truly values that child, and how the child experiences that. So that by taking in, the love and care that the parent showers on that child's sense of self-esteem is enhanced. By contrast, when a child who has one of these neurological problems feels criticized, feels put down, feels demeaned, that crushes their self-esteem, and that sets the stage then for possible problems for the rest of their lives, where they don't feel confident, where they feel sort of that around the corner somebody will detect their weaknesses, and there's uncertainty about how they should deal with situations. It undermines then the whole structure of their character and personality.
And we should emphasize, as guidance to parents here, to find something that can authentically and sincerely be called out that the young person, the kid, is good at, so that one can validate. I mean, someone who's struggling with soccer, you don't necessarily want to tell them how great they are because they know the truth. Kids know what's so. And so the coaching to the guidance for the folks is to find something that can genuinely be a source of self-esteem. Most everybody's good at something. Now, we have about 1 minute before we go to break, and I want to emphasize that when we come back, I think it would be useful perhaps to get an example up on the table and to connect the dots between issues in behavior, action, how kids of all ages feel about themselves, and issues in neuroscience and learning. We are neurons all the way up and all the way down. My special guest today is Joseph Palombo, founding dean, the Institute for Clinical Social Work, and director of the Joseph Palombo Center for Neuroscience and Psychoanalytic Social Work. We will be right back.
See Lou on the web at louagosta.com. That is spelled LOUAGOSTA, or phone 773-203-0269. Again, louagosta.com, or phone 773-203-0269. You may also send an email to arumorofempathy@gmail.com. Now, back to the program.
This is Lou Agosta. Welcome back to A Rumor of Empathy. My special guest today is Joseph Palombo, founding dean, Institute for Clinical Social Work, and director of the Joseph Palombo Center for Neuroscience and Psychoanalytic Social Work. Say that fast 5 times. Before the break, we were talking about connecting the dots between learning disabilities and neuroscience. And sometimes it happens that children of tender age with challenges in the matter of learning grow up to be adults with learning disabilities. Let's see if we can get an example on the table. Back over to you, Joe.
Thank you. Let me introduce this first by saying a word about the center. What we're interested in this center is translating for people the vast knowledge that is accumulating in the area of neuroscience to practical applications in many, many areas of day-to-day life. In child rearing, in education, in issues that affect children who have injuries, for example. We know a great deal now in terms of the neuroscience of how the brain works. There's a great deal that we do not know about how the brain works. But what we do know still remains to be translated in language that parents can understand, that teachers can understand, and even that clinicians can understand, so that they can put that knowledge to use in their day-to-day practice. So
making a difference for children and parents alike.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. So this is really the mission of our center. But in more direct...
I'm inspired. Let me just say I'm inspired. And that's one of the reasons. I mean, what really inspired me is the humanity. People are dealing with a lot of stuff. I mean, in school, in jobs, and as you say, some of it people are born that way, or they have kind of traumatic or negative experiences. In other cases, they're injured.
That's correct. And what's often left out, the medical profession does a wonderful job of addressing the medical problems of people with brain injuries. We have kids who have suffered from brain tumors who undergo procedures that, like radiation procedures that affect their brain function. What is left out in all of this is how the kids experience that, how they feel about it, which is where empathy enters in. It's like, how do we understand? Well, let me give you just a brief example. There's been a lot written about nowadays, a lot of talk about concussions and the effects of concussions on football players, and more specifically on kids. We know a great deal about the effects of the brain trauma itself, and the prescription is, well, put the kid on the sideline, don't let him play for 3 or 4 days or maybe a week until he recovers. But what is left out is the child's emotional experience. What we know, for example, in terms of the emotional experience is, if you take a kid who's dedicated a lot of his career in high school to football, and suddenly he is injured and is sidelined, and for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month cannot play, what inevitably happens, in my experience, is the kid gets depressed.
Yeah.
Something has been left out of his, all the attention, all the investment that he had, and all the energy that went into practices is no longer available, and so the child is left with this empty space that he cannot fill. And the crushing aspect to the self-esteem of the child is then what brings on these feelings of isolation, loneliness, the loss of the friendships that he has with the other team members, which can be quite traumatic.
Devastating, even. I mean, I am vicariously sad. I mean, this is a tough situation because you don't want to damage your head irreversibly, right. And on the other hand, this is the young man or young person's life, right. And the social connectivity. And so, to be bold, I mean, what is the intervention here? I mean, obviously, yes, injuries and drugs change the brain, but so do conversations. So
Absolutely. Right. I mean, that child needs to talk with somebody in order to be able to address the feelings, to address the depression, to find alternative ways of gaining some of that self-confidence and redirecting it in a way that allows some kind of recovery. Now, I wanted to give you another example that our listeners may be interested in of how a learning disorder can affect an adult and relationships in adulthood, too. I mean, what we're talking about here in kids is fairly much in the news. What isn't in the news is I was thinking of an example, and this is kind of a disguised example so as not to violate the confidentiality of the material I gave. But a couple comes because they have been at loggerheads arguing with each other.
A couple. So this is a couple.
This is a couple, yes.
Got it.
Married for 10 years, 2 children, and they're at a point where there's so much conflict that they're considering separating or divorcing because there are, quote, irreconcilable differences. And so what are the differences? They're both competent people. They're both professionals. The woman is a lawyer, successful in the firm where she works. He is a physician, and he does very well. But there's something wrong in the relationship. And what's wrong in the relationship is that the gentleman is disorganized. So, mom says, don't forget to pick up the kids from daycare this afternoon because I won't be able to do it. At 4 o'clock, she gets a call saying, why aren't you picking up the kid? So she calls her husband, oh, I forgot. I was in the middle of doing something, and I forgot to do that. And there's this huge argument. Then she says, well, would you mail these letters for me because it's important for them to go out tomorrow, otherwise our bills won't get paid. 2 days later, she discovers he's forgotten to mail the bills. Or to mail the
and
letters.
The car is being repossessed. Bad joke, right?
And
it's a breakdown. It's an upset, huh?
Numerous such incidents to the point where she says he doesn't care, he's not attentive, he's so involved in his work, he's not paying enough attention to the kids, how can we go on living like that? He's not being an adequate husband or father. I'm done with him.
This relationship is in breakdown.
Right. Okay, so they come for therapy, and I begin to explore what's going on. Now, given my knowledge of neuroscience and learning disorders, I quickly recognize what this gentleman has is what's called an executive function disorder. What that translates into is that he is disorganized, not because he's inattentive or unmotivated, but because some people's brains don't work in a sequential, orderly way. And so keeping track of time, keeping track of details, is a challenge for people like that.
This is brilliant, Joe. This is really brilliant. I have a thought, but go ahead. Please continue.
Well, we have a lot of examples of kids in high school where they do very well for the first, 9th, 10th grade, and then they get into freshman or sophomore year in high school, and they implode. What happens is they don't turn in their homework, they can't keep track of assignments, they're late, they can't get to school on time, and the disorganization takes over their lives, and of course, parents then get frantic. They are trying to structure the kid, and the kid is rebelling against the structure, and so
it's a negative feedback loop. And when by the time they get to therapy with you,
right.
You have to work through the anger and the resentment and the back and forth and round before you can get at the fundamental problem.
Exactly.
Which is the disorganization. Let me give you one more thought.
Yes.
Your empathy enables you to redescribe what seemed to be lack of caring, indifference, devaluing terms like laziness as an executive function disorder. It made me think of, attention deficit disorder of various kinds is in the news these days.
Right.
In fact, there's a secondary market amongst high school students and college students for, it's bad, medications that address the matter. But we don't necessarily want to go there. The question then becomes, it's a nice way in which your empathy enables you to redescribe this breakdown, this big honking upset. In neurological terms, in terms of neuroscience. The tough question, which no softball questions here today, what is the intervention? What's the recommended treatment? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, okay, if we take the couple, having identified the problem now, and we sent the gentleman for testing to confirm that indeed this is what he has. The testing comes back, and so we have a series of sessions with both of them where I explain to the wife that her husband's problem doesn't have to do with caring or not caring or being motivated. It has to do with the way his brain works. And so what we're trying to instill in her is empathy for him that goes beyond the criticism that she has for what he does to an understanding that he has. It's like a handicap. It's like, you're asking somebody who is, traumatically injured and has had a stroke to exercise the arm where the stroke occurred. He can't do it. There have to be compensations for that. So the empathy is, A, to understand the person, then to help the spouse have empathy for her husband's impairment, and then trying to find practical solutions so that his impairment doesn't interfere with their lives and their relationships. And there are other ways of compensating. They may have to have, a babysitter. They may have to deprive themselves from going out in order to support someone who's going to help complement what he cannot do so that the relationship can be saved.
So let me see if I can get inside what the guidance and the coaching is here, because, there's always tips and techniques, and, this individual may usefully carry a reminder or a schedule, whether it's on a smartphone or, pencil and paper also works pretty well, too, in a pinch. But your commitment, the breakthrough is in terms of helping these individuals expand their empathy for one another, and instead of bringing anger and devaluing terms, to say, like, hey, what's really going on here? And the metaphor of an actual, reasonable accommodation. If somebody has a neurological damage to their arm, reasonable accommodation may be appropriate. And so you're redescribing, in effect, translating the situation in terms which take out the negative affect.
Right.
Which take out the hatred and the bad feeling and the contempt and the resentment and the round and back and forth, which are so challenging.
Exactly.
And so that's called talk therapy.
That's part of talk therapy.
Help me out here.
Well, my definition of therapy goes beyond what the traditional people consider. Many people think, well, you're going to work through the conflicts that a person has, the guilt that they have, the shame that they feel. I feel that as a therapist, if you're working especially with people with these handicaps, you have to go beyond just sort of the talk aspect to teaching them about what the impairment is. One of the first things that we need to do with people like that is to say, you need to understand the nature of the dysfunction, because if you don't understand it, then you're going to misinterpret the behavior. And so there's a didactic component that goes in, and then beyond that, there's what I call the empowerment component. That is, the person, the couple, has to take charge of their lives to make changes that allow them to either compensate for the deficit or find ways for others to complement their deficits.
Yeah. Well, we have about 1 minute till we go to break. Let me give that back to you. When you say learning and education, we should define our terms there, I think very broadly, in the sense that you're learning or helping or guiding them to get in touch with their feelings, to introspect what is their own experience. I mean, it's not just, I'm guessing, but I've got to believe it's not just informational, but this therapy is a process of learning itself how to articulate one's experiences, emotions, interrupt the funk, interrupt the negative thought, which means one has to do some free association there too. Yes?
It's both, yes.
Yeah,
but there is a didactic component also. We can get back to that.
Well, I think we're about 1 minute from the break. When we come back, what I'd like to do, I mean, there's like 101 issues on the table, but empathy is usually like motherhood and apple pie. What's not to like about that? And yet sometimes there's resistance to empathy. Sometimes it's like, well, let's talk, this apple pie is kind of fattening, and let's talk about my mother. She's a wonderful woman and very empathic, my late mother. And nevertheless, sometimes talking about one's mother can be confronting. When we come back, I want to guide us in the direction of looking at what you might call the dark side of empathy. Is it always good? Is there something? What are the trade-offs there? So with that thought in mind, we are talking to special guest Joseph Palombo, founding dean, Institute for Clinical Social Work, Chicago, and director of the Joseph Palombo Center for Neuroscience and Psychoanalytic Social Work. We will be right back.
Success starts here. VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com. It's your world.
We're making it easier to listen to the Voice America Talk Radio Network wherever you go. In addition to listening live, you can check out information about your favorite talk show hosts, discover new talk show personalities, add shows to your list of favorites, and listen to all our show archives on demand. All from your iPhone, BlackBerry, or Android. Download it from the Apple App Store, BlackBerry App World, or Android Market, and get ready to tune in. The Voice America mobile app, powered by Aircast.
Lou Agosta is one of the premier educators and empathy consultants in action in the community today. As the author of 3 books on empathy and a PhD from the University of Chicago Philosophy Department on Empathy and Interpretation, Lou provides 3 services: empathy consulting and education, in which he coaches individuals and organizations on how to expand the results they are getting in their life, business, or organization by expanding their empathy; individual psychotherapy services to help with recovery from trauma or other confronting personal issues, where Lou's commitment is to provide a gracious and generous listening, as providing access to shifting out of resignation into engagement, action, and accomplishment, and delivering the empathy training seminar and workshop for groups, where the participants get access to the deep infrastructure of empathy. For further details, see Lou on the web at louagosta.com. That is spelled Louagosta, or phone 773-203-0269. Again, louagosta.com, or phone 773-203-0269.
You need to live up to your full potential. You've heard that for years, but now there's a channel to help you get there. Introducing the Voice America Empowerment Channel. Our listeners have told us that they want to be motivated, hear about success stories, and positive encouragement around the clock. And we've responded to you. The Voice America Empowerment Channel is the home of the world's top life coaches, entrepreneurs, and success experts. Listen to the Voice America Empowerment Channel. It's here at VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com.
Follow us on Twitter for more great ideas at Voice America Empowerment.
You are listening to A Rumor of Empathy. To reach Lou Agosta or his guest today, please call in to 1-888-346-9141. That's 1-888-346-9141. You may also send an email to arumorofempathy@gmail.com. Now, back to the program.
This is Lou Agosta. Welcome back to A Rumor of Empathy. My special guest today is Joseph Palombo, founding Dean, Institute for Clinical Social Work, and director of the Joseph Palombo Center for Neuroscience and Psychoanalytic Social Work. Before the break, we were saying empathy is supposed to be so great, but couldn't there be a dark side to it as well? What are the trade-offs? Joe, back over to you. What are your thoughts about that?
Could we just continue a thought before we get back to this?
Sure.
I wanted to introduce something that you and I talked about during the break, which has to do with a different way of thinking about therapy and looking at what we're doing as addressing a system rather than individuals.
Yes.
And the systems approach really is very useful in reconfiguring how we think about the interventions we make with couples. What we're doing essentially is by introducing new information, by empathy, understanding differently what the patients experienced, we are really helping them rebalance their relationships so that a new configuration emerges out of the shift in attitudes, and what we have is what we call an emergent property, which is a new system of relationships that exists among the members there. And that then allows them to relate to each other in a healthier, more constructive way.
Well, brilliant. I mean, in terms of the example you were giving before the break, this couple comes in there and breakdown, back and forth, resentment, the guy can't remember anything, he's disorganized, and you in effect, your tool in the therapy is empathy, and it enables the individuals to see things that they had not seen before, because some of the phenomenon, the behaviors, the actions get redescribed. Instead of being a jerk, he is forgetful because he has an executive function disorder. Instead of being down on the relationship, he just has a measure, for want of a better description, of attention deficit. Redescribing that changes the system, allowing on a good day, affection and affinity emerge. Allowing the couple to have empathy for one another. Am I getting this right?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's correct. And
that's a systems approach, huh?
Yeah. This is what I'm working on in a new book, which I hope to be published in the next year or so.
Well, give a shout out to that. I mean, is there a working title so we can look for it on Amazon?
Tentatively, it's going to be Self-Deficits and the Search for Complementarity. The search for complementarity is really a very important concept in terms of how I think about helping people with these disorders. You know, what we don't realize is how much others fill in sort of the holes in our brains or in our minds in an unconscious way, sort of I was this summer last summer we had as our guests a couple where the husband was becoming senile, and what was happening there was the wife had taken over functions that he had lost. She was his memory. She structured his time. She filled in cognitive deficits that he was losing and became sort of the complement to what he needed. Well, in our daily lives, people complement us in many ways. If I forget a word or something, people will jump in and sort of fill it in, or you're going to remind me when it's time to stop. These are complementary functions that each of us provides others. We only are aware of them when they're missing.
Let me say, so the point I'm getting is that we human beings do that for one another, even when there's not some neurological disorder.
Absolutely.
My wife and I are perfectly healthy, knock on wood, God bless, and all of that. And we do that for one another. We remind one another. And not just memory, but emotionally, effectively, in all of these ways. We are, to bring it back where we started with Heinz Kohut, he's got this distinction, right? The self-object, where we help one another to regulate our emotions, our thoughts, our affectivity, our relatedness, kind of what we do in a conversation.
I add to the concept of self-object, which is the emotional needs that other provides for us, the concept of adjunctive functions. And adjunctive functions are those cognitive functions that others fill in for us.
Yeah.
And we need both of those in order to, lead our daily lives. Without that, we will not succeed, we will fail. A good marriage, to me, a good relationship is one where each complements the others in both aspects. So that's part of the reason for calling the title of my book being The Search for Complementarity, which is that in people with those deficits, they are constantly looking for, who or what is going to fill in the deficits that I have to allow me to have a sense of cohesion, as Kohut, a sense of well-being.
A sense of integrity.
Right.
And a sense of cooperation. This is the basis. I'm making this up now, but it sounds to me like the basis for cooperation, teamwork, for getting things done in community. It's fundamental. It's big.
Absolutely.
It's bigger than big. I'm not sure what bigger than big would be, but we'll find out when your book gets published. So we'll look forward to that. And
thank you.
Thank you. I know from our conversations otherwise, you are a synthetic mind. You are a synthesizer, among other things. In addition to the innovations you bring to this work, and it's the connecting of the dots, which is not easy to do, between neuroscience and talk therapy, dynamic therapy, understanding human beings as emotionally embodied. And so that kind of, before we kind of digressed here. We were going to talk about the dark side of empathy.
Yes.
You want to go back? You want to go back there?
Yeah, I do, because it raises a concern, and that people don't often think about this, quote, dark side of empathy. Kohut emphasized the fact that empathy can be used to good ends or to evil ends. His favorite example was that the Nazis used sirens on their dive bombers in order to terrorize people. They knowingly, used that, using their empathy, because they knew what would instill fear.
Yeah.
Now, when I think about the dark side of empathy, the other thing that comes into mind, which has been in the news recently, is those two psychologists who used their knowledge of human beings in order to enhance the interrogation techniques that the CIA was using in the Guantanamo Bay jail or in the black sites.
Yes.
And what's involved here is really that you have to know the weaknesses of your victims, and that requires a measure of empathy in order to most effectively sort of obtain the results you want from that. To me, that is, it's hard to think of that as empathy, but indeed, that depth of understanding requires the measure of empathy.
Well, and this is very confronting, difficult material and controversial. We want to call it out. There may be reasonable individuals may disagree about some of these tough things, enhanced interrogation, and of course, having a conversation is different than waterboarding. And I gather the psychologists were mainly passing on. This is not Dump On Professional Psychology Day. We can schedule one of those some other time, because the majority, like the vast majority, dedicated, committed to overcoming managing, dealing with human suffering, making a difference using empathy. Nevertheless, this is a celebrated case in the news. Yes. And as you say, the Nazis on using, using empathy or some distorted version of it to be more effective. The psychologists in enhanced interrogation using some distorted, for want of a better description, and psychopathy as well. I mean, there's a whole list of things that can go wrong. People, some psychopaths don't have a conscience. Others really don't seem to pick up on the kinds of emotions that empathy would make available. Some individuals suffer from both lack of conscience. What's your guidance here? I mean, how do I turn? I'm just not even sure what the question is. Other than, can you help me out? Can you say more?
Well, I guess the general point is that without empathy, we as human beings become islands isolated from the rest of the world. We need empathy to be interconnected with others. But then how we use that empathy really defines who we are, the values that we have. I mean, it brings us back to the values that Hume sort of proposed as humaneness. So if we think about empathy in its broadest way, that yes, we have to be mindful that we can hurt others through our knowledge of their weaknesses. We can also enhance them. We can also be connected and bring good in the world as a result of our capacity to empathize and to provide for others' emotional needs.
Indeed. And so basically, empathy tells me what the other person is experiencing, whereas morality, ethics, and humanity tells me what to do about it.
Yes. Right.
Well, I mean, I must say this has been an engaging, dynamic, rewarding conversation, Joe, Dean Palombo. We are out of time. And so let me thank you and thank the listening audience. A rumor of empathy is no rumor in the work you are doing, Joseph Palombo, at the Center for Neuroscience and Psychoanalytic Social Work. Next week, my special guest is Misha Zupko, musician, music professor, and composer, and an amazing conversationalist. Join me next week for a rumor of empathy in music. We'll see you then.
It was a pleasure being there.
Thank you for tuning in to A Rumor of Empathy with Lou Agosta. Please join us again next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Empowerment Channel. We hope to see you again next week.